An avoidant woman doesn't fear losing you. She fears realizing you were rare. After hurting a good man, her first fear is not abandonment, rejection, or loneliness. It's recognition. It's the moment when distance creates clarity instead of relief. Because once you're no longer present, once the emotional noise quiets down, she begins to see the pattern clearly. She sees how steady you were without demanding, how you showed up without controlling, how you stayed emotionally available without trying to own her. And once that recognition forms, it can't be undone. She can rationalize your absence, minimize your impact, or rewrite the story for others. But internally, the truth has already landed. You are not ordinary. You were regulated. And that realization is heavy for someone who survives by emotional escape. What makes this fear so powerful is that it brings pressure, not pressure from you, but pressure from within. Because recognizing your value forces her to confront something she has spent her life avoiding. The contrast between safe love and familiar distance. You didn't overwhelm her. You didn't trap her. You simply existed with emotional consistency. And that consistency highlighted everything she struggles to sustain. Your calm made her instability visible. Your patience exposed her avoidant. Your emotional presence showed her what intimacy actually requires. Not intensity, not drama, but responsibility. And that responsibility feels threatening to someone who learned early that closeness comes at a cost. You didn't just love her, you became a mirror she never asked for. Through you, she saw the version of herself that shuts down instead of leaning in, retreats instead of communicating, and protects independence at the expense of connection. That gap between who she is emotionally and who she knows she would need to become to keep a man like you is where the fear lives. Because crossing that gap would require vulnerability, self-examination, and change. An avoidant attachment isn't about lacking love. It's about lacking safety in emotional exposure. So instead of moving toward growth, she moves away from the reminder, not because you were too much, but because you represented something too real. A good man doesn't demand transformation. He naturally invites it. And for an avoidant woman, that invitation feels like a spotlight on every unhealed wound she's been running from. Losing you is painful, yes. But realizing she had someone rare, someone stable, grounded, and emotionally available is far more terrifying. Because rarity doesn't come around often, and once it's recognized after it's gone, there is no defense left. Only awareness. And awareness is the one thing avoidance can't outrun forever. She didn't pull away because you were too much, she pulled away because you saw too much. A good man doesn't interrogate, diagnose, or accuse. He reflects truth simply by being consistent. And avoidants don't actually fear love in itself. They fear mirrors. They fear being emotionally exposed without having done anything wrong on the surface. Your presence did that, not through pressure, but through contrast. You showed up the same way on good days and difficult ones. You stayed emotionally reachable. And in doing so, you made her internal inconsistencies visible, even when she tried to hide them from herself. You noticed her patterns before she ever named them, the way her warmth arrived in waves, then disappeared without warning, the way closeness triggered distance, the way connection was followed by silence, distraction, or sudden independence. You didn't call it out aggressively. You didn't demand explanations, but you felt it, and she felt that you felt it. That's what unsettled her, because being seen without confrontation leaves no room for denial. There was no fight to blame, no dramatic conflict to hide behind, just awareness quietly forming in the space between you. After hurting you, this fear sharpens, because now she knows you're not confused, you're not lost in hope, or chasing clarity. Distance gave you perspective, and what she fears most is not that you miss her, but that you finally understand her, that you see her accurate, not as complex, misunderstood, or emotionally deep but wounded, but as emotionally unavailable by choice. That realization threatens the identity, avoidance, protect at all costs. The belief that their behavior is circumstantial, not pattern. Avoidant attachment survives through ambiguity, through stories that soften reality, through explanations that sound reasonable enough to avoid responsibility, but clarity destroys that. And a good man who sees clearly becomes dangerous, not because he judges, but because he no longer participates an illusion. Once you see the shutdowns, the distancing, the emotional exits for what they are, you can't unsee them. And she knows that. She knows you're no longer guessing. And that's what makes her uncomfortable, not guilt. Being seen clearly means she can't return later and rewrite the past. She can't frame the separation as bad timing or mutual misunderstanding because you didn't leave in confusion. You left with awareness. An awareness removes access. It means she can't rely on you to question yourself while she avoids questioning herself. And that loss of power is deeply unsettling for someone who regulates emotions through distance. So her fear isn't exposure to the world. It's exposure to you, to the one person who didn't need her to explain herself to understand the truth. The one who didn't chase clarity because he already had it. And once an avoidant woman knows a good man sees her without distortion, without fantasy, and without self-blame, she knows something else too. She can't hide from herself through him anymore. And that is a fear no amount of distance can fully silence. Avoidants panic when they realize this time the door actually closed. She's used to people waiting, used to emotional access remaining available even after distance, conflict, or withdrawal. In her experience, connections stretch, they bend, they pause, but they don't usually end, especially not with someone who cared deeply, especially not with a good man who showed patience, understanding, and emotional restraint. So when you step back quietly, without anger, without ultimatums, without chasing, something inside her destabilizes because this is unfamiliar territory. There's no drama to decode, no argument to revisit, no emotional noise to hide behind, just absence. And that absence doesn't register as space. Space still implies return. Space suggests safety. Space leaves the door cracked open. But silence from someone who once stayed feels different. It doesn't ask for reassurance. It doesn't demand repair. It doesn't linger emotionally in the background. It feels complete. And that completeness is what triggers panic, because finality removes control. It takes away the option of later, and avoidance survive by believing later always exists. She's used to the idea that if she reaches out, you'll respond, that if she circles back, the bond will still be there, softened by time but intact. That even if she distances, the emotional thread remains uncut. But when a good man leaves with dignity, that illusion collapses. Because you didn't leave to teach a lesson, you didn't leave to provoke pursuit, you left because something in you shifted. And she feels that shift instinctively, not through words, but through the energy that's no longer reaching for her. Irreversibility is terrifying for avoidance because it removes escape routes. Distance is their regulator. Withdrawal is how they calm themselves. But when distance leads to loss instead of relief, the strategy fails, and that's when panic surfaces. Not because they suddenly want closeness, but because the familiar cycle no longer works. The push no longer invites pull. The silence no longer guarantees return. And that breaks the emotional math they rely on. What makes this fear even sharper is how quietly it happens. You didn't announce your exit. You didn't seek closure. You didn't leave breadcrumbs of longing. You simply stopped participating. And that absence forces a realization she can't avoid. This wasn't a pause, it was an ending. And endings require grieving, not control. They require acceptance, not strategy. And avoidants fear acceptance because it means feeling what they've been avoiding all along. Loneliness for an avoidant is manageable. They've lived with it internally for years. But permanence, that's different. Permanence means there's no emotional doorway left to reopen when fear subsides. No safe return once the nervous system calms down. It means the cost of avoidance finally arrived. And when that realization settles in, it doesn't come as heartbreak. It comes as something quieter, a deep, unsettling awareness that the one person who would have stayed no longer will. And that is the fear that lingers long after the silence begins. She doesn't fear you being replaced. She fears she can't replace you. A good man isn't loud, flashy, or overwhelming. He doesn't compete for attention or demand reassurance. He's steady, grounded, rare. And rarity doesn't announce itself while it's present. It's only fully recognized once it's gone. After hurting you, she doesn't immediately miss you as a person. She misses the way her nervous system felt around you, the absence of chaos, the quiet stability, and that's when the comparison begins. Not consciously at first, but instinctively. Every new connection is measured against what you offered without effort. Your patience when she pulled away, your regulation when she became distant, your emotional safety when she didn't know how to receive it. Other people may be interesting, some may be exciting, some may even feel intense, but intensity isn't the same as stability. And avoidants often confuse the two until they've lost the one person who didn't destabilize them. That's when the fear sets in. Not the fear that you'll move on, but the fear that no one else will feel the same internally. What terrifies her is not competition. Competition implies choice. It implies options that can be weighed and replaced, but what you offered wasn't an option. It was a baseline she didn't know she needed until it disappeared. Emotional safety can't be recreated through chemistry. Regulation can't be forced through attraction, and patience can't be demanded from someone who hasn't done the inner work. Those qualities exist quietly and rarely in the same person, and she knows that now. So even when she dates again, there's an underlying disappointment she can't fully explain. Something feels off. Conversations feel stimulating, but not calming. Attention feels flattering, but not grounding. Presence feels conditional instead of consistent. And she may blame timing, compatibility, or not feeling it. But the truth is simpler and more unsettling. The standard changed, not because she healed, but because she experienced something better and lost it. Substitutes are easy to find. Someone who listens occasionally, someone who shows up when it's convenient, someone who offers affection without depth, but equivalence. Someone who stays regulated when things get uncomfortable, someone who doesn't withdraw when closeness increases, someone who holds emotional space without trying to control it. Those aren't common traits, they're developed traits. And once she realizes that, a quiet fear follows her into every new connection. Because replacing you would require finding someone who offers what you gave without the patience you used to have for her avoidance. And that's the part she doesn't say out loud. You weren't just rare because of who you are. You were rare because of how much you tolerated before leaving. And now that you're gone, the cost of replacing you isn't just finding another good man. It's becoming the kind of person who can actually keep one. Avoidants don't fear regret. They fear regret with no access. Regret by itself isn't overwhelming. It can be softened with explanations, diluted with time, or temporarily relieved through reconnection. When access remains open, regret has an outlet. An apology can be offered, a message can be sent, a conversation can reset the emotional balance just enough to quiet the discomfort. That's how regret stays manageable. It moves, it releases, it doesn't stay long enough to demand transformation. But once you stop seeking closure, everything changes. When you no longer ask for explanations, no longer wait for accountability, no longer keep the emotional door open, regret loses its escape route. It can't be discharged through repair because repair is no longer available. And that's when regret becomes heavy. Not dramatic, not urgent, just constant. It sits in the background, unresolved and unspoken, with nowhere to land. For an avoidant, this is deeply unsettling. Their nervous system is wired to avoid emotional buildup, not process it. Distance is how they regulate. Withdrawal is how they calm discomfort. But regret, without access, doesn't respond to distance. Silence doesn't dissolve it. Time doesn't erase it. In fact, the quieter things become, the louder it gets internally, because there's no conversation left to soften it. No reassurance coming from you. No opportunity to rebalance the emotional dynamic. This is why avoidants often reach out only when access feels threatened, not when regret first appears, but when it becomes unbearable, when they sense the door is truly closed. Because regret with access feels temporary. Regret without access feels permanent. And permanence is the one thing avoidance can't neutralize. What she fears isn't accountability in the moral sense. It's emotional containment. Accountability requires sitting with discomfort long enough for it to change you. It requires acknowledging harm without immediately repairing your self-image through forgiveness or reconnection. And that kind of stillness is intolerable for someone who learned early that emotions must be escaped, not integrated. When you were still seeking closure, she could postpone this reckoning. Your questions gave her time. Your openness gave her options. Even your pain allowed her to feel needed. But once you stopped, regret lost its leverage. It could no longer manipulate connection. It could only exist. And existence without resolution is what makes it unbearable. So the fear isn't that she hurt you. The fear is that she may have to live with that knowledge without being able to soften it through repair, without being able to hear that she's understood, forgiven, or still welcome. That unresolved weight doesn't scream. It lingers. It waits for quiet moments. And avoidants run from it, not because they lack remorse, but because remorse without access forces them to finally feel what they've spent a lifetime avoiding. The scariest realization isn't "I lost him," it's "I do this every time." Hurting a good man doesn't just create loss, it creates comparison, not between partners, but between timelines. Past relationships begin to overlap. The emotional arcs start looking familiar. The beginning felt promising. The closeness felt manageable at first. Then came the discomfort, the urge for space, the shutdown, the slow emotional exit disguised as independence or logic. And suddenly the ending looks exactly like the others. Different faces, same outcome. That's when fear sharpens, because repetition removes excuses. You can blame circumstances once. You can blame timing twice. You can even blame the other person if there's chaos to point at. But a good man leaves quietly. He doesn't create a mess big enough to hide behind. He doesn't explode or betray. He simply stops trying when effort stops being mutual. And that forces an uncomfortable conclusion. The problem didn't come from outside. It came from within. Same distancing, same emotional shutdown when closeness deepened. Same internal justification that framed withdrawal as self-protection instead of avoidance. These patterns didn't begin with you, and they won't end with you unless they're confronted. And that's what terrifies her. Because recognizing a pattern means recognizing responsibility. Not blame, responsibility. It means acknowledging that the emotional injuries weren't accidents, they were outcomes. Predictable ones. What she fears isn't being flawed. Everyone is flawed. What she fears is being consistent in her damage. Because consistency demands intervention. Patterns don't break themselves. They require awareness, discomfort, and sustained vulnerability. And avoidants are skilled at managing relationships without ever touching the core wound. They change partners, they change environments, they change stories, but they avoid changing themselves. When a good man leaves, the usual narrative collapses. There's no dramatic conflict to distract from introspection, no villain to point to, no chaos to validate withdrawal, just a calm absence that quietly says, "This didn't have to end this way." And that sentence echoes louder than any argument ever could, because it suggests something unbearable, that love didn't fail. Avoidance did. Recognizing yourself as the common denominator is destabilizing because it removes hope rooted in external change. You can't fix this by waiting for the right person. You can't outrun it with independence. You can't intellectualize it away. The pattern will repeat until the behavior changes. And change requires vulnerability, not emotional exposure in short bursts, but sustained presence when discomfort rises. The very thing avoidants have trained themselves to escape. So she fears this realization, not because it makes her feel bad, but because it makes her feel responsible. Responsible for the loss. Responsible for the pain. Responsible for the future. And responsibility removes the illusion of safety and avoidance. Because once the pattern is seen clearly, repeating it becomes a choice. And living with that awareness is far more frightening than losing any one relationship. After a good man, chemistry feels loud, but hollow. At first, intensity can distract from the loss. New faces, new conversations, new sparks. Excitement returns quickly for someone who associates attraction with emotional activation. Chaos feels alive. It feels familiar. It feels like movement. But beneath the stimulation, something is missing. Not immediately, but gradually. Because intensity alone doesn't regulate the nervous system. It agitates it. And once someone has experienced regulated love, agitation no longer feels like connection. It feels unstable. Intensity is easy to find. It shows up fast. It flares quickly. It creates urgency and obsession and emotional highs. Avoidants often mistake this for passion because it doesn't require vulnerability, it requires reaction. Chaos keeps the focus outward. It prevents stillness, and stillness is where unmet emotional needs begin to surface. So at first, these connections feel promising, alive, engaging, but they don't settle, they don't ground, they don't create safety. Emotional safety, presence, and depth are different. They don't announce themselves dramatically, they unfold over time. They create a sense of being held without being trapped, of being seen without being exposed. And that's what she lost with you, even if she didn't fully realize it at the time. You didn't stimulate her nervous system, you regulated it. You didn't create emotional highs. You created emotional stability, and once that baseline has been experienced, the absence becomes impossible to ignore. This is where the fear emerges, because every future connection starts to feel incomplete. Exciting conversations don't soothe, attraction doesn't calm, attention doesn't anchor. There's energy, but no containment, movement, but no direction. And she begins to sense that something fundamental is missing, not in the other person, but in the dynamic itself. Love feels performative instead of grounding. Emotional exchanges feel reactive instead of safe. She may tell herself that she just hasn't met the right person yet, that it's a timing issue, that chemistry will eventually deepen into stability. But deep down, she knows that what she experienced with you wasn't chemistry evolving, it was regulation from the start. And that kind of connection doesn't appear easily. It requires two people who can tolerate closeness without losing themselves. Two people who can stay present when things are calm, not just when things are exciting. The fear isn't that she'll be alone. The fear is that she'll keep finding connections that look like love but feel empty underneath. That every relationship will start loud and end quietly. That excitement will mask instability until it collapses. And that realization creates a haunting contrast. Love that felt safe and love that feels stimulating but unsatisfying. Once regulated love is felt, everything else feels unstable, not because it's wrong, but because it lacks grounding. And that's the fear she carries forward. Not that she won't love again, but that she'll never feel settled again. Because the one connection that brought calm instead of chaos is gone. And calm, once known, becomes the standard everything else quietly fails to meet. She didn't fear hurting you, she fears living with the version of herself that did. Avoidant women don't suppress emotions in the way people assume. They don't erase them, they postpone them. They compartmentalize feelings and store them away until distance makes it safe to feel. And that's why the truth doesn't arrive during the relationship or even right after it ends. It arrives later, quietly, without witnesses, without confrontation, without anyone there to absorb the weight of it with. When it comes, it doesn't look like guilt. Guilt implies urgency and self-judgment. This is different. It's contrast. A slow, unavoidable comparison between what she chose and what she lost, between the comfort of avoidance and the cost of it, between independence and connection, between emotional safety and emotional escape. And once that contrast forms, it stays. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand action. It simply exists in the background of her life, reshaping how everything else feels. She replays moments she once minimized, times when you showed up calmly while she pulled away, times when you asked for closeness without pressure, times when you stayed present, even when it was uncomfortable. At the time, those moments felt suffocating, too intimate, too exposing. Now they feel different. Now they feel like care, like effort, like love. That didn't require drama to be real. And that realization doesn't come with relief. It comes with weight. Because by the time she sees it clearly, you're no longer there to receive the insight. There's no conversation to correct the past. No chance to re-enter the moment with a different nervous system. No opportunity to show up differently. The truth arrives after access is gone, and that timing is what makes it unbearable. Not because she wants you back, but because she wants to escape the awareness of who she was when it mattered. Some fears aren't dramatic. They don't show up as breakdowns or desperate messages. They live silently in the way future relationships never quite feel right, in the way emotional safety feels both desirable and threatening, in the way she hesitates when closeness begins to resemble what she once had and pushed away. That hesitation isn't about you, it's about the memory of the self she doesn't want to become again. The deepest truth she hides isn't that she misses you, it's that she knows you didn't fail her, you didn't abandon her, you didn't fall short. You met her where she was. And that's what exposed the gap. You offered something she wasn't ready to sustain. And living with that knowledge requires accepting a version of herself she would rather outgrow quietly than confront directly. So the fear remains, not loud, not urgent, just persistent. The knowledge that the good man didn't fail her, she failed him. And while distance can delay emotions, it can't erase that contrast. It simply waits until the quiet makes it impossible not to hear.